this is the new improved version of trying to have lectures be available online. So I'm going to try it this way. I'd like your feedback on this one. And then this one I'm recording just in my office. It's going to be kind of short. The assumption is you'll use the extra time to take your quiz. But then if this works, we're going to go with this way all the time. So here we are. We've got skin. We're looking at the integumentary system, which is the skin, and it's also things like hair and nails. But today we're just looking at the first part, and so that's going to be layers of the skin and then pigment. And we're getting done early, and you can take your quiz. The quiz is timed at 10 minutes. The idea for that is that then it's open book and open notes. So you'll be able to, if you want to look through something quickly, you can do that. But it's not going to be long enough for you to teach yourself everything. Hopefully you know and understand the things. I do want to check that my recording is actually recording. It looks like it is. So we're going to keep going. I'm excited about this. If this works, I think it'll be good. If it doesn't, I don't know what the solution is. Okay, so the integumentary system consists of skin, that's the major player, and then hair and nails and sweat glands and oil glands. Skin itself has two distinct regions. So remember that there are different tissue types, and to be an organ you need to have at least two tissue types going on. So skin is an organ. Skin consists of the epidermis, which is the top upper layer. That's epithelial tissue, and it doesn't have blood vessels to it. The dermis is going to be lower. It's going to be underneath the epidermis. It's mostly connective tissue. It's got blood vessels to it. And together, that's skin. The organ of skin is the epidermis and the dermis. Beneath the dermis, there's the hypodermis. It's deep. It's not part of skin, but it shares some of the functions, and it's associated with skin. So it's mostly adipose tissue, and so that's going to be doing things like absorbing shock and insulating it. It's also the hypodermal layer is also going to be connecting the dermis to mostly muscles that are underneath it. You don't want your skin to like slide around, like how if you're wearing rubber gloves and you can twist them and they slide. You don't want skin to do that. Skin needs to be anchored to the deeper structures. So here's a picture. Lots of things going on. We've got the epidermis up here, the most superficial, the top layer. You'll see that it folds down. So this epidermal layer, you'll see it's made of epithelial tissue, and that it's called invagination. It folds down sometimes. It folds down for things like hair follicles. We'll talk about that later. And then there's the dermis, which is this nice thick layer here that has a lot going on, and we'll go through that. Deep to that, you've got the hypodermis. It's here mostly these little fat pockets. It's adipose tissue. And again, as we're looking at getting oriented to this, you'll see that there's blood vessels here in the dermis, and we're not expecting blood vessels up here in the dermis. So cells of the epidermis are mostly keratinized. Doesn't have anything to do with carrots. It has to do with the protein keratin. So these cells have been, they've had keratin added to them. They're tougher than normal. So it's mostly keratinized, stratified, so lots of layers. Squamous, the top layer is flat. Epithelium, so epithelial tissue. All right? Four main types of cells found in the epidermis. Keratinocytes are going to produce keratin, and that's the protein that's giving skin its big protective properties. It's the major cell of the epidermis. Most epidermal cells you're seeing are going to be these guys. They're connected to each other. They've got tight connections, and millions of them are going to be falling off all the time. If you look at your house and you see like dust, some of it's dirt, a lot of it is skin cells that have come off. Melanocytes are going to be deep. So while keratinocytes are going to be all over the place. We've got some up here that are dead. We've got lots of different layers down to here. This is the dermis. Up here is the epidermis. Melanocytes are going to be deep in the dermis. So they're still in the top layer of skin. They're in the epidermis. Sorry, did I say dermis? I meant epidermis. They're still in the epidermis, but they're in the lowest level of the epidermis. They're going to be producing, as the name suggests, they're going to be producing melanin. So they'll be producing melanin. This melanin is going to be then packaged into little vesicles and transferred to other cells, right? Having this melanin, we're going to talk about it at the very end of class, is going to be protective to the cell from UV damage. The third type of cells that you'll see are Langerhans or dendritic cells, different names for the same thing. They're these spiky, they're described as being star-shaped. I'm kind of seeing more pom-pom, but they're these spiky type of cells. They're macrophages. They're deep in the epidermis, so they're still in the epidermis, but again, they're deep. They're not on the outer level. And they act as activators of the immune system. When they notice something has gone wrong, they'll trigger an immune response. This is very helpful because the skin acts as a major barrier between outside and inside. And it's critically important that the integrity of the skin is maintained, and if it's broken by something, so something gets through that layer of defense, you want the immune system to know. Finally, there are tactile cells. These are Merkel cells. They're sensory cells that respond to touch. There are lots of different types of touch, so there's like light touch and deep pressure and vibration. Merkel cells can do some fine touch, right? So if you're going to pick up, or if you notice like a bug is crawling across you, it's probably the best example. You notice that a bug is crawling across your skin, your Merkel cells have probably picked up on this. You'll notice that these cells are embedded here, right? So this is the epidermal layer. This Merkel cell is embedded. As its processes are deformed, as things move, they're able to send a signal to a neuron that's able to activate the nervous system. Say, I've sensed something. So the epidermis has those four types of cells. The epidermis also has several distinct cell layers. So you have 4 or 5, meaning all skin, the epidermis is going to have at least 4 layers. Places that have thick skin are going to be your hands and your feet. Thick skin has 5 layers to the epidermis. These layers are worth knowing. Stratum is going to mean layer. And we've got these 5, and this is starting from the very base, moving up to the very, very outside. We're going to look at all of them here. So the basal layer, the stratum basale, but basal layer, is the deepest of all the epidermal layers. It's this base level, right? It's very firmly attached to the dermis. It's attached. This layer is just a single row of stem cells that are busy dividing. So a stem cell will divide. It makes 2 dollar cells. One stays put to continue to divide, and another one is going to keep moving on. It's the layer that also can be called a germ layer because it's just really, really busy in mitosis, meaning these cells are dividing all the time. Dividing and cells are moving up. About a tenth to a quarter of this layer is also going to be melanocytes, so there's also going to be some pigment to the skin. Just above that, so we have base layer that's got these dividing stem cells that are going to be producing most of this, that are going to be just constantly producing keratinocytes. You next up have what's called the prickly layer, stratum spinosum, spiny. It's several layers thick, and these cells are going to be prickly because they've got all sorts of connections amongst them. Let's go to here, sorry. right here, if we're looking, they're prickly looking, they're connected to each other. And this is really important because you don't want them to like fall apart. Not yet, at least. You want them to be connected to each other to resist tearing, to be able to handle stretch, that kind of thing. So that's the second layer up. We've got the basal layer, we've now the prickly layer. The next layer up is going to be the granular layer. It's several layers thick, but at this point the cells start to change. The cells flatten. They used to be big and puffy. They used to have all sorts of things going on. They were a regular cell, right? So they were a regular cell with regular organelles doing their thing. But at this layer, the granular layer, they've started to change. And as you might recall, I hope you recall, epithelial tissue, and epidermis is epithelial tissue doesn't have blood vessels to it. So the deep layers, like the basal layer, there's blood in the dermis. And so that blood in the dermis is able, the nutrients, the oxygen are able to get to the base layer just fine. Back up here, they're still able to get to the prickly layer, right? They're able to diffuse across. By the time we're at the granular layer, the cells are fairly far away from these dermal capillaries. It's hard for them to survive. And so they start to die. Above this layer, above layer 3, they're definitely dead. But just because they're dead or dying doesn't mean that's a bad thing. So here at this granular layer, the cell appearance starts to change. The cells flatten, these organelles are breaking apart. They start to be keratinized, so keratinization, which is a fun word to say, meaning they get packed full of this tough protein. So now, what used to be the cell, and I guess still is the cell, but it's dying or dead, the cell is a lot tougher. It's full of this protein. They also accumulate a bunch of glycolipids. Basically, you can think kind of like wax. So this glycolipid is going to prevent water loss, or at least slow water loss. So that's a big concern with skin. It's exposed to the air, and you can lose a lot of water through there. So the next layer up, so we've gone from base layer, we're moving up. The next layer up is only found in thick skin. So you're expecting it on your hands and on your feet. It's got several layers, of some clear, flat, dead keratinocytes. It makes things thicker. The last layer you'll find in all skin. It's called the stratum corneum. So that means horny layer that's like horn. It's not like horn in its shape. It's in horn just because it's kind of tough, almost like fingernails. Not quite, but that horny kind of idea. You've got 20, 25, 30 rows of these flat cells that are dead. They're full of keratin. They've lost their nucleus. But just because they're dead doesn't mean they're useless, right? So they're dead, but they're still doing stuff. The things they're doing are protective. So they're protecting the other cells. They're preventing water loss, again, because they've got this glycolipid in them that can help, kind of, you can imagine like, I don't know, saran wrap almost. They're going to help protect against all sorts of punctures or abrasions. Excuse me, we'll talk about this more when we get to the immune system, but they're also acting as a barrier. So they're acting as a physical barrier, right? Against punctures and wounds and bugs crawling. And if you pick up a pine cone, you can hold it without having it poke holes in you. Whereas you wouldn't want to have a pine cone like hit your liver, like that would be a problem. But they're also going to act as a chemical barrier. So your skin's slightly acidic. It's mostly dry. It's going to help protect against, say, bacteria from flourishing. You have plenty of bacteria on your skin, but not as much as you would unless your skin was actively preventing it. Cells are going to be dying in droves. You're losing a lot of them. They're going to be coming off as dandruff, like visible flaky dander. There's a slight difference. Basically, this is more or less. There's more technical definition, but the not technical difference is dandruff is coming off your scalp. You can see it. Dander is the other skin cells and hair and whatnot that you're just shedding. I'm not sure how the internet, how research found this number, but you're shedding tons of cells. So the best estimate is about 50,000 cells every minute, skin cells. You're going through these rapidly. So here's this picture. Again, this one we're seeing the 4 layers. Down here's the dermis, so we're just looking at this epidermal layer, right? Base layer, cells are dividing rapidly. We've got some melanocytes there. Up above it, we've got the spiny layer, the prickly layer. We've got these cells connected to each other, holding on. Stratum granulosum, this granular layer, the organelles are starting to divide. It's starting to dissolve. That's why it looks granular. And then above this, we've got the horny layer, or the stratum corneum, meaning that the cells are dead here. Lots of layers. This outermost layer is getting sloughed off, and then as cells divide, they're going to be moving up. We're missing, this is thin skin here, so we're missing the stratum lucidum, which in thick skin we'd see right here between the stratum granulosum and cornea. So that's the epidermis. Now the dermis is this next level, and I'm realizing I'm being nervous, but I want to check this recording just to make sure it's working. Looks like it's still on. Okay, back to what we're doing. The dermis is not epithelial tissue. So the epidermis is epithelial tissue. The dermis is connective tissue. It's also got, so it's got fibroblasts, which are making bunches of fibers, right? It's also got macrophages, which are going to be clearing up things that shouldn't be there. It'll have mast cells, which are important for the immune system as well, and white blood cells, again, an immune system component. These fibers, and again, fibroblasts are here helpfully making fibers. There's a bunch of fibers in the matrix that help bind stuff together. There's also a bunch of other things going on here. There's going to be nerves, there are blood vessels, there are lymphatic vessels. Everybody always forgets the lymphatic vessels, but they're there. And where's the picture here? A better picture is this one. They'll also have, so even though we're here in the dermis, right, the epidermis has bulged down, again, invaginated, and so you'll have the hair follicles and like sweat glands that are epidermal in nature, but they're folded down inside into the epidermis here. And back to where I'm going. Yeah, so sweat glands, oil glands, that kind of thing. They come in 2 layers, papillary and reticular. So we've got epidermis up here. All through here, we've got this epidermis here. You see this layer is all the dead layer, the horny layer. We've got right here where this is the base layer where things are actually dividing, right? Anyways, we're down here in the dermis. We've got the papillary dermis. It's loose connective tissue. It's areolar connective tissue. Sometimes there are little projections that happen. In thick skin, there's these projections that happen. We'll get to that. So papillary dermis, fairly loose. Then there's the reticular dermis, which is going to be dense and irregular connective tissue. So this papillary layer is this more superficial layer. So when I say superficial, I mean closer to the surface. And when I say deep, I mean deeper into the body. So the dermis is deep to the epidermis, right? It's underneath the epidermis. You've got epidermis, dermis. But in the dermis, there's the papillary layer that's higher up. And it's this very loose layer. It's got this areolar connective tissue. It's got collagen and elastic fibers. It's got some give to it. It's decently strong, though. It's got blood vessels going through it. And because these fibers aren't super tight, they're not jammed together, they're not packed in, there's room for phagocytes to patrol around, to wander around. So then if microorganisms show up, they can find them. The dermis also has these little finger-like projections that go up into the dermis, right? And these projections are important for a variety of reasons, mostly for, they've got some capillary loops, so for some blood supply, but they're mostly important for sensation. So we see this right here, right? It's popping up in there. Briefly, we've got, when people talk about touch, they often act as if it's only one thing, but there's lots of different portions of touch, or components of touch. So there are free nerve endings, which are going to do things like pain. There are going to be touch receptors that are going to do things like pressure, right? So the difference between those, say, Merkel's discs that were there in the epidermis and we're doing some light sort of touch, you've got touch receptors that are doing things like pressure, right, or stretch. When we get to sensation, we'll talk more about these, but in the dermis there's a lot of sensory receptors. Yeah, so we're still in the papillary layer. In thick skin, this layer ends up forming dermal ridges, right, so like this kind of mountain rangey kind of idea. And the epidermis that's on top of that is going to follow that, and those will make epidermal ridges. They're called friction ridges, just together. They're supposed to make it gripping better, specifically because the idea is you have like little moats that sweat can go through, so you're not as slick. They're also supposed to enhance the sense of touch, just because of increased surface area and now increased ability to have sensory receptors there. That being said, you can have really fantastic sensory, you can have good sensory discrimination even in other areas. So like your eyelids, or I guess your lips, aren't terrible at sensory input either. You also have a mostly unique fingerprint pattern. There might be some people who have very, very similar fingerprint patterns to you, but it's unique enough to work for a lot of cases. Here's a picture. So that's the papillary layer. Deep to that, there's the reticular layer, and that's most of what the thickness of the dermis is. And this is going to be connective tissue that's pretty tough. It's fairly deep. It's fairly dense. It's got elastic fibers to provide some stretch recoil properties, right? So like if you pinch your skin, you want to be able to go back. You want it to not stay stuck up. If it does stay stuck up, you're probably dehydrated. Consider getting a drink of water. So you've got elastic fibers that are providing some of the stretch. You have collagen fibers that are going to provide a lot of the strength. They'll also hold on to water to keep your skin hydrated. In the reticular layer, well, just deep to the reticular layer, you have a whole bunch of blood vessels. It's called the cutaneous plexus, and you have a bunch of blood vessels there. There's also little blobs, little pockets of adipose tissue, of fat tissue there. This is just a kind of a side note, it's not super important, but the reticular layer has all these collagen fibers, right? And collagen fibers they run all over the place, but they run in certain patterns. And this is important to know because kind of how like if you're tearing paper, you can tear it along the grain or against the grain. Or if you're cutting meat, you can cut it along the grain or against the grain. Cleavage lines are important because while they're invisible just on the surface of the skin, they do make a huge difference in how skin heals. So if you're a surgeon, you want to make sure you're making incisions appropriately so it'll heal up with fewest scars. You might have noticed this before, that like sometimes you can get two different cuts and they're both equally deep, but one of them scars over dramatically and the other one you can't even notice. And that has a lot to do with the way the collagen fibers in the dermis are running. Are you cutting with them or are you cutting against them? It's just a side note. You'll also, this is probably obvious, but you might have noticed on like your hands or places where you have joints, they're built-in folds, and that's because the dermis is tightly tied on to the deeper structures, and it should be. That's important. It needs to not fall off or slide around. But because of that, and you don't want it to slide around, because of that, you have to have creases. You need creases. So your skin has creases. You'll see it on like your knuckles, and they're just called flexure lines, right? Finally, for just the basic skin part, if you stretch the skin a lot, you can tear at the dermal layer. So if the epidermis gets rubbed off or things happen, it's not a huge deal, right? I mean, you don't want all of it to go, but the epidermis is expecting to be lost. But if you stretch down to the dermal layer and it tears, it'll leave scars that are known as stretch marks. This is especially prominent in, say, pregnant women if they suddenly need to increase their skin size dramatically, right, because of developing infant. So suddenly gets bigger faster and their dermal tears. And this can also happen in obesity. This can also happen in, say, something like swelling. So like there's just been a sprain, there's suddenly a lot of swelling, and the skin gets stretched really tight. Also, if the skin gets rubbed too much, typically through any sort of trauma, but specifically through repeated rubbing, you can end up filling up a pocket between the epidermal and dermal layers. It's been rubbed and you fill up with fluid, and that's a blister. Finally, so that was basically the structure of skin. Finally, we're looking at skin color. There are 3 pigments that contribute to skin color. They're not all from the skin, though. The only pigment that the skin actually makes is melanin. It's made by those melanocytes. They're at the base layer. Think about base layer of what? Dermis or epidermis? Right? It's the base layer of the epidermis, right? The base layer of the top layer of skin. It's made melanocytes but sent to most skin cells. The point of this is to shield DNA from sunlight. So sunlight can damage DNA. That can become a problem. The cells aren't behaving the way you want them to behave. So melanin protects from it. Sun exposure stimulates melanin production. So this is why you'll notice getting tan the more you're in the sun. For some people, some of us, it's more challenging to tan than for others. It's very sad. But yeah, you'll see melanin production increased by sunlight. It comes in 2 different versions. There's a yellowish version, a reddish yellowish version, and a brownish blackish version. Differences in skin color arise from the amount and the form of melanin. Yeah, you'll notice that typically individuals with ancestry near the equator will be producing a fair amount of melanin to protect, because the expectation is quite a bit of sun and fairly intense sunlight, whereas individuals who are historically evolutionarily from extreme northern regions, right, you're expecting less. Again, the concern about sun damage isn't such a concern. The concern is getting enough vitamin D, right? And you need sunlight. You can get some vitamin D from foods, but typically you can get vitamin D from skin exposure to sunlight. So in extreme far, well, basically it's north, because very few people live in Antarctica. Less melanin is still okay because you're not so worried about the intensity of the sun, but you need it for the vitamin D. Whereas if you're close to the equator, you're not so worried about vitamin D because you're getting plenty of sunlight exposure, of strong enough sunlight exposure too. And then freckles and moles are, again, it's because of melanin. You're getting these little packets of little accumulations of melanin. Melanin is helpful, is protecting against sun damage. Too much sun damage can make elastic fibers clump up and make the skin become tougher, more leathery. The big problem is it can damage, too much sun exposure can damage DNA, and that can lead to skin cancer. Yeah. Other things that cause skin to be different colors are things like keratin. It's not produced in the skin, but it can accumulate there. It's yellowish, orangish. You don't usually notice it, except, say, in the palms or the soles of the feet. It can be noticed if there's like none of it or a ton of it. There's also hemoglobin, so that is in blood, and there's blood pretty much all over the place. And if there's not a lot of melanin in the epidermis, hemoglobin can show through, slightly pinkish. Now, alteration of skin color can indicate disease, and you can see these alteration of skin colors on light-skinned people and dark-skinned people. For the slides, it's easier to see on light skin, so I've put them here as that. I do recognize it comes up, like cyanosis, not having enough oxygen, can happen regardless of skin color. It's an indication of low oxygenation, again because of a blood problem. It looks bluish, the extremities. It's easier to see the less melanin there is, just because it's not getting in the way, but it happens. These things all happen no matter the skin color. Cyanosis is an indication of low oxygenation, so like right here. It's usually seen on, say, like fingers or toes, but can happen anywhere. Things can go red from like an allergy or a fever. It's some indication typically of inflammation or an immune response. Blanching is when there's basically suddenly less blood pressure. There's less blood behind something. So you'll see this in, say, anemia, or if people get really scared or angry, they can do this too. Also, we'll get to this more when we talk about liver. Jaundice is when skin shows up a little bit yellowish, or very yellowish. It's a problem because of a buildup of a pigment that happens because of liver concerns. Bronzing can also happen. This one's subtle to notice. I mean, the individuals experiencing it notice it, but for other people it takes a little bit more typically. So like these two hands here, these two ladies are sisters. This lady has not been out in the sun more. She used to have a skin tone similar to her sister's, but she's experiencing Addison's disease, so she's got bronzing. It's a problem with steroid hormones, and it leads to this bronzing effect. Also, skin can be discolored because of bruises. So this is just like clotted blood beneath the skin, and they can come in different colors. You might have noticed sometimes they're blackish, sometimes they're yellowish, depends on exactly what's going on, but that's again showing through the skin. So that's what we have for today. Do take your quiz. You online people, your quiz is going to be open longer. You don't have longer to do the quiz itself. Like once you open it, you have 10 minutes. Again, that's to encourage, like, what do you know? Don't just do all your studying with the quiz open. But you'll have until Sunday night to do that quiz. So things to know. I hope this works. Please let me know how the sound quality is, how the video quality is, if this is gonna work. And yeah, I'm really hoping this is good. Thanks, and bye. Stop recording.